Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles to the Angelo Robles podcast. I'm also the founder and CEO at Family Office Association. Today, we're going to cover everything you wanted to know about investing in psychedelics. It features Tim Schlidt, partner of Palo Santo Fund. Really excited about today. In the public markets, I've been a bit of an active investor in this community. I think it's very intriguing from multiple different perspectives, and one, like many verticals, you could argue, that potentially offers intriguing, arguably asymmetrical type returns. I know my audience is used to me saying that more in crypto and digital, but that's not the only thing that is worthy of investing in those that may offer a quote unquote, to some degree, more outsized returns. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Angelo.
Yeah, really excited about today. This is a subject I've mentioned as a question to some people in a unique way, but I've never had a guest on relative to specifically investing in psychedelics, and we hope to do more of this because, again, I think it's an intriguing subject with a lack of education and information for a lot of people. So the main purpose of psychedelics is to improve health, promote wellness, and alleviate suffering. How does, and let's see if I could lump them in together, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, ibogaine, mescaline, and other phenethylamines, if I pronounce that correct.
Phenethylamines, either or, yeah.
What are they and how do they do this differently?
Yeah, so and it's a broad question. And as you can tell, there's certainly a lot of psychedelics out there. So I think people are used to the big ones, magic mushrooms, LSD. Some may have heard of ketamine, for example, but there's a lot more than that as well. So it certainly shows the breadth of opportunities out there in terms of molecules to explore here and to invest in. And the range of potential indications they could address. So let me start with the big ones that I think have been the psychedelics du jour the past few years, and that's really MDMA and psilocybin. So MDMA is the furthest along, aside from ketamine, in terms of being close to commercialization. So an organization called MAPS, which is a nonprofit, is advancing MDMA for the treatment of PTSD. And the efficacy rates for that in particular have been pretty remarkable, that 76% of patients with treatment-resistant PTSD are in full remission after 1 or 2 MDMA sessions. So usually PTSD, you mask symptoms. We treat it with, SSRIs, antidepressants, or in some more recent cases, cannabis, but you're kind of masking symptoms, whereas MDMA seems to actually be a cure to this. And there's a lot of physiological reasons we could get into why that's the case, but that's furthest along aside from ketamine, which is already commercialized. So ketamine is used off-label. It's a dissociative anesthetic. The mechanism is quite different from a lot of the other psychedelics. Most of the psychedelics are known as tryptamines, or in that sort of tryptamine class, and activate what's known as the 5-HT2A receptor. And we can get more in depth on these. I know I'm getting a little wonky there. Ketamine activates a very different receptor known as the NMDA receptor. But again, it's an anesthetic, has been used for decades, but scientists found that it's actually remarkably effective in treating depression, actually, and giving very quick relief from depressive symptoms. So you think about someone who's potentially acutely suicidal, to tell them, hey, we're going to put you on antidepressants. It's going to take 6 to 8 weeks at least for it to kick in. It's a pretty tough prospect for someone who's really has an acute case or is experiencing some real suffering. So ketamine seems to provide immediate relief. The tough thing about ketamine is it doesn't seem to be as durable. So people have to keep coming back for ketamine sessions. And it can be quite expensive. It'll take 2 to 3 hours per ketamine session. And so it's quite, takes quite a bit of time. Psilocybin, so that is the active compound in magic mushrooms, has been another really popular one. That is in phase 2 clinical trials with a nonprofit called USONA, advancing it for major depressive disorder, as well as a for-profit company called Compass Pathways, which is advancing it for treatment-resistant depression. And that's really compelling too. Psilocybin seems to be a lot more durable in its effect. So it also provides immediate relief like ketamine, very different mechanism of action. We can get into that later, but also seems to be far more durable. You have 70% of patients in long-term remission from depression symptoms 6 months plus out from one administration of psilocybin. So those are the really popular ones. And then beyond that, we can dive into it a bit later. 5-MeO, DMT, as well as DMT are a bit more esoteric in terms of compounds. They're newer on the scene, less data around them, seem to be effective for depression and potentially addiction as well, especially 5-MeO could be effective for cocaine and meth addiction. And then DMT seems to be effective for a whole host of addictive symptoms. LSD was used in Alcoholics Anonymous decades ago for treating alcohol use disorder, so very effective there. Ibogaine, incredibly effective for opioid use disorder. So I'll pause there because I could keep going on about them, but you can see a wide range of potential indications that these can address within psychiatry, as well as we have not even gotten to outside of psychiatry. These seem to be potently anti-inflammatory, could be useful for neuropathic pain, a whole range of indications outside of mental health alone. So it's a very investable universe, without a doubt.
So kind of, I guess, very much a softball question for you. Could I state that there are already medications out there to treat some of the disorders that you noted? How does some of the things that we mentioned compare from an efficacy, low toxicity, as well as, I think, an important one, lower abuse potential?
Yeah. Well, so that's another remarkable thing about these is I think people go, especially on the addiction front, they say, okay, you're treating addiction to a drug with another drug. How does that work?
Right.
But I think, when we use the term drug, that's such a broad label. And that's like looking at a car and not differentiating between stick shift versus manual. It operates very, very differently. And I'd say the same thing goes for psychedelics, that a lot of these operate very differently from other drugs out there. So drugs with high abuse potential, like let's say methamphetamines, cocaine, you name it, which are illegal. We can get into drugs currently on the market, but ones that are illegal, those operate largely on the dopamine system. Whereas for a lot of these, especially psilocybin, LSD, the classic tryptamines, the classic psychedelics, they mimic serotonin. If you look at a serotonin molecule, these look remarkably similar to serotonin molecules and bind to a lot of the same receptors as serotonin molecules, what's known as the 5-hydroxytryptamine receptor. So they mimic that, and things that are serotonergic in nature don't seem to have high abuse potential or high risk of addiction. So that's even when comparing to illegal things, compared to alcohol, even something that is legal, but certainly has high abuse and high addictive potential. Now, going to drugs currently on the market, I think the big comparison here is to antidepressants. And how do these stack up relative to antidepressants, which are legal, currently the most popular method used for treating depression? And a few things on antidepressants. I think, they've been a pretty blunt instrument, and I don't want to poo-poo anyone who's gone on medication or had to. I think it's a necessary potential first step, or it's the only tool we've had in the toolkit for 30 years. And we have seen minimal innovation on that. But the issue with antidepressants is, one, they take a long time to take effect. As I hit on earlier, they can take 6 to 8+ weeks to really kick in for people. And then for a lot of patients, they don't even work. For about a third of patients, they seem to be effective. So there's a mild statistical significance in their effectiveness rate. But for a large number of patients, about another third, they kind of middle along. They experience some relief, but not total relief. And for a whole other third of patients, they seem to get no relief from antidepressants. So they're not a panacea by any means. And then with them, there's a lot of nasty side effects that people don't love. There can be increased sweating, loss of libido, which is a really undesirable side effect, which impacts relationships for people, increased weight gain. So you think about the pro con of that. The pro is you may get relief and it's going to take some time. The con is you have a lot of undesirable side effects. And that's where you see a lot of people not wanting to go on antidepressants who do need therapy or do need treatment nonetheless. So there's that. And then people do develop dependency to antidepressants. It's very difficult to wean off antidepressants, and we don't have a lot of great regimens to get off of them. So big pharma loves that because you get recurring revenue off of that. But for the patient, it's a bit of a raw deal. I mean, in an ideal world, you do a treatment, you get relief, and you can go back to your normal life non-medicated. And antidepressants rarely offer that prospect. So psychedelics seem to be a better mousetrap in a lot of ways, at least the early data is showing.
So building upon what you're saying, and I think you actually hinted at what my next question is going to be, the engagement of big pharma, the powerful sales network they have, and the comfortable that many doctors are with the traditional ways to treat. Now it's going to be an education of some new opportunities out there, but importantly, how could big pharma get involved? If they're not going to profit, they're probably not going to be too interested. How do they take something like some of the things we noted, and do they add certain compounds to it? Does that, how does that interplay? By the way, as luck would have it, feel free to answer that question long form. My alarm is going off. I'm going to take my video off and address that. Feel free to answer that and go long form on it.
Sounds good. And for the record, the alarm's pretty muted, so don't worry. Nothing, doesn't sound obnoxious, but yeah, I'll run with that one for a little bit here. So I think for big pharma, there's a few things. One, a lot of classic antidepressants have gone generic. So they're past their patent life, they've gone generic. And for big pharma, usually when that happens, they go into either R&D mode or acquisition mode. And we've seen most new drugs now come out of biopharma and early stage biotech, not out of big pharma anymore. It used to be big pharma a decade or two ago, but that paradigm has flipped. So big pharma tends to acquire now. So I actually think that offers hope for a lot of psychedelics, that you could see acquisitions by big pharma down the road as the picture becomes clear around how psychedelics commercialize, what the IP looks like on a lot of these. So there's certainly that prospect. And what a lot of people are looking to mimic is what we saw in the cannabis world and what occurred with GW Pharma, which had advanced Epidiolex. So it's a nice analog. It's in cannabis, so very different in terms of what diseases they were targeting, but still gives a nice glimmer of what psychedelics could pull off. That you take a compound through clinical trials, you commercialize it, and you have a big exit. So GW Pharma got acquired for $7.2 billion by Jazz Pharma about a month or two ago. So investors certainly made a pretty penny on that. So that's one part of, it's one leg of the stool here, is the prospect of acquisition, which I think is a nice exit path for a lot of investors in psychedelics. Another one is, people talk about this, the effectiveness of psychedelics, and could you have repeat medication use? Is the market that big then if someone takes these one or two times and then they're cured for life? I think a few things around that. One, the population sizes we're going after are so large and appear to be growing faster than the rate of population growth, that I think the market potential is really, really big. That even if you have a highly effective treatment, it's such a large market that there's going to be tremendous economic potential around that. And for anyone who can uproot a $16 billion per year antidepressant market, there's a lot of potential there for economic profit out of that. So that's another thing to consider on this is that factor. And then, all right, here you go. I was running with that a little bit longer to give you some time, Angelo, but I'd say those are the big things to consider around, what big pharma would do here and the potential with these. Last comment I'll make is what a lot of people are working on. There's a big debate going on in the psychedelic field right now of, do you need the trip or do you not need the trip to get a therapeutic effect? So let me first set the stage on how these are administered, because I think that is a big caveat to highlight here, that these are not going to be, at least the first generation of psychedelics will not be for take-home use. So no one is going to be able to go to a pharmacy, get psilocybin, go home and kind of trip their brains out on their own. The way these are going to commercialize, again, with first gen, is that you'll see a therapist, you'll be in a room with a therapist, you get administered a high dose of, let's say, psilocybin. You are in a very highly psychoactive state, but that's where we seem to see a lot of the therapeutic potential manifest. But you have a therapist overseeing this, a trained therapist, a trained guide who knows how to handle the ropes here and knows how to manage patients in a psychoactive state. So that's first thing, the caveat here. Now, with that said, a lot of people are speculating that there's a lot of therapeutic effect you can get even without the trip. So even without the psychotherapeutic angle here, that just by activating the 5-HT2A receptor, it seems that that's where a lot of the antidepressant potential is with psychedelics. You get increased, they have a psychoplastogenic effect as well. So the brain goes into kind of a more free state and can sort of settle into new patterns of thought. You seem to get neuroregenesis as well from these compounds. So there's a lot of other therapeutic effects outside of the trip that theoretically you could get even while you eliminate the psychoactivity. So people are working on different angles there of, could you design a psychedelic drug that activates the 2A receptor, but you don't get the trip effect from it? So there's a company called Delix working on this. Gilgamesh is advancing a less psychoactive form of ketamine, for example. It's an analog of ketamine. Atai has a company called Perception Neurosciences, which is working on R-ketamine. It's an enantiomer of ketamine, which seems to be less psychoactive. So that would be really generation 2 of psychedelics in a lot of ways, is taking out the psychoactivity, and you could potentially get take-home use, but a lot of the less, the undesirable effects you get from antidepressants, that these could be a superior form of antidepressants. So it's a bit more of a speculative area, but it is a high growth area we see in psychedelics for the years to come.
Well, kind of related to that, maybe discuss the range of potential indications that these could address: CNS disorders, TBI, neuropathic pain, neurodegenerative diseases, and I would argue from research, inflammatory related diseases as well.
Yeah. So that's what we really like, is I think if we were limited to just mental health in our investment thesis, even though that is the big topic and that really takes the
And
headlines,
very important, of course.
and of course, very important, and probably the most pressing issue. I call
For
that
sure.
the second pandemic in a lot of ways. You look at post-COVID, the data is showing that anxiety and depression rates have increased by 3 to 4x following COVID. So this really will be the second pandemic in a lot of ways. So that is the hot topic. But outside of that, and I'd say that encompasses really depression, PTSD, anxiety, and OCD are some of the big disease categories there, where in the patient population sizes are in the hundreds of millions, if not billions now in a post-COVID world. But outside of that, there does seem to be a lot of promise to, as you highlighted, around traumatic brain injury seems to be one area to go after. There is a company called Wisana that's targeting TBI with psilocybin, and it's a combo formulation of psilocybin, I believe CBD also combined with it. So that's a big area of exploration. Another one is neuropathic pain. So psilocybin in particular seems to be highly effective in treating cluster headaches, interestingly enough. And for a lot of cluster headache victims, they don't get a lot of relief from other medications out there, or it's much lower efficacy rates, where psilocybin seems to be really effective. So a lot of these start in the anecdote, but anecdotally, we are seeing evidence of that. And we are investors in a company called Beckley Psytech, which is also working on a subset of cluster headaches. It's an orphan indication known as SUNHA specifically. So that the cluster headaches, it encompasses a pretty broad umbrella of potential sub-indications there. So that's another area. Within neuropathic pain, you have fibromyalgia as well. There's a company called Tryptamines, which is exploring psilocybin for treating fibromyalgia as well, albeit a bit more speculative, but certainly potential there. And then the one I find really interesting is inflammation. There seems to be really good evidence that certain psychedelics in particular are incredibly potent as anti-inflammatory. So LSD does not seem to be that anti-inflammatory, but psilocybin, very anti-inflammatory. And one of our scientific advisors for the fund, and also an advisor to Elucis, which is a really big company in the space, Charles Nichols is his name, found that he started hearing anecdotes of people coming away from psilocybin retreats saying, hey, I had really bad eczema, or I had some inflammatory, rashes, or you name it, something that was giving hints of inflammation. And after a high dose session of psilocybin, it just went away. Like the week after, it totally went away, which is pretty remarkable. So he started there in the anecdote and said, there's something here. Let me dig further, and found a compound called RDOI, which is an analog of mescaline, actually, and then has been building analogs after that scaffold. But has found that compounds in the mescaline family in particular seem to be even more anti-inflammatory and relatively non-psychoactive as well, which is the interesting part. And when you think about that, inflammation, that's a big umbrella that can encompass asthma, eczema, diabetic retinopathy, irritable bowel disease. The list goes on and on of inflammatory diseases. So it's not like inflammation is one indication. That covers a very wide range of potential indications. So that's what's pretty remarkable about these compounds, is that the use cases extend just beyond mental health. So back to our main point, mental health is certainly the headlines here, but we do see a lot of potential beyond that. Oh, Angelo, you're muted out now.
We kind of discussed this a little bit already, but maybe diving a little deeper. How do these actually work? Discuss the mechanisms of action underlying psychedelics and explain the therapeutic effect. In other words, what receptors do they hit, and how does this manifest itself in the body?
Yeah. So let me focus on what are known as the tryptamines, which the classic tryptamines are psilocybin, LSD, DMT, long form known as dimethyltryptamine. and 5-MeO DMT as well. So it's 5-methoxy dimethyltryptamine. So those are kind of the main classic psychedelics. You do have other ones like ketamine, ibogaine, which seem to have different mechanisms of action. So I think that it's best to focus on the classics. But if you look at, so serotonin receptors are called 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors. So serotonin, so classic tryptamines mimic the serotonin molecule in a lot of ways. So I know I made this point earlier, but I'll repeat it because I do think it's a big point to highlight, and also highlights how there's low addictive potential here. LSD, psilocybin, if you look at the shape of those molecules, they're remarkably similar to serotonin molecules, and they bind to a lot of the same receptors as serotonin. And as we know, SSRIs, antidepressants, they're selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So a lot of the clues around what one of the mechanisms underlying depression is that it seems to be some dearth of serotonin in the system. In some way, people seem to be lacking serotonin, not producing as much of it, not keeping as much of it in their system, and that's what makes them depressed. So what psychedelics do is they really mimic, or they replicate serotonin in a lot of ways and bind to those same receptors that serotonin binds to, and they kind of fool the body into thinking that it's taking in more serotonin, and that's kind of our happy molecule to really put it into elementary terms. So the receptor where we think there's a lot of therapeutic effect from psychedelics in particular is the 5-HT2A receptor. There's a number of 5-HT receptors. There's 5-HT2B, 5-HT2C, there's 5-HT1A. There's a whole host of them. But the one where we think there's the most therapeutic effect is at the 2A receptor. Now, the irony of that is the 2A receptor is also where we get a lot of the psychoactivity. So that's an issue where people are trying to hammer out here is, back to my earlier point, can you take out some of that psychoactivity, but maintain that therapeutic effect from these? So that's what we've seen. That's kind of our early glimmers around these of how they tend to work. And then different molecules are shaped differently. So the way to think about it is your receptor is kind of like a keyhole, and the molecule is like a key. Now, it's not as simple as an on-off switch. Different molecules will shape the receptor differently, and you'll get different downstream effects. So mescaline versus psilocybin versus LSD, they're going to shape the keyhole slightly differently, and then the lock it'll act accordingly. So you'll get different levels of psychoactivity, a different duration and effect. So it's not as clean of an answer as it sounds in terms of just on off, and it doesn't matter what psychedelic you take, you're going to get the same therapeutic effect. It is different across compounds, but hopefully that gives a nice sense of how these tend to work in the body.
It does. Discuss how psychedelics will leapfrog cannabis in achieving de facto legislation by going an FDA-approved route, which I would believe is far superior in comparison to how the cannabis industry has advanced.
Yeah, so this is something I really like about the commercial path of psychedelics, and something a lot of people don't realize, because I think initially you bring up the topic and people are like, whoa, we're still getting cannabis, we're still trying to get over the hump, the cultural hump there. And there's a lot of states that still, where cannabis is illegal still. So, we forget that. So it's kind of, how do you convince portions of the deep South to then, grapple with psychedelics here? So psychedelics are going a very different path than cannabis. Cannabis has really been recreational, or the medical use case has been more by state legislation, where you can get a medical card, you go to a dispensary, but that path is very different. So the way psychedelics are going is they're trying to mimic Epidiolex, which is one of the few companies, which was advanced by GW Pharma. That's one of the few companies in cannabis that really truly leaned in to this medicalization path. And what Epidiolex pulled off was they were a scheduled substance. They were, DEA Schedule 1. They were a banned substance. They took it through clinical trials, and the DEA is subservient to the FDA on these matters. So we have to remember, Schedule 1 is that there's harm to the user, or significant risk of harm, and no known medical use case. So both of those conditions have to be met. So if you find a medical use case, you then have to be rescheduled. So if you take these compounds through FDA clinical trials, you find a medical use case, if they successfully make it through and you find a use there, then the DEA has to reschedule these. So the thinking is these probably will get rescheduled to Schedule 2 or 3. So a little bit less onerous. There will be controls around them, but then at least they can be prescribed by doctors for the designated indication, and that can be done at a federal level. So psychedelic focused biopharma companies can go through normal banking channels. It's totally above board, assuming you have, when you're researching these, assuming you have a DEA research license at time of research, For companies providing the active pharmaceutical ingredients, they need a DEA distribution license. So getting those licenses can be a little onerous. But aside from that, the business model is legally totally above board. So we're not operating in a gray area like a lot of cannabis focused funds are. And it's been interesting. That's where, in terms of lawyers we can work with, banks we can work with, you name it, it's totally above board and they're very open to it. There's nothing that's getting in the way of it. So I like that in a way that you don't have to go by referendum. You don't have to go by ballot box to get psychedelics approved. You can go via the FDA route, and there's very specific endpoints that are specified that if you hit those, then you will get FDA approval around these. And the tone at the FDA has really changed significantly, where they're very receptive to these. 4 psychedelic drugs have received FDA breakthrough therapy designation, meaning the FDA review process has been shortened by 30 to 40% roughly. So the FDA is certainly very accommodative. And we saw that both under the Trump administration, as well as now certainly under the Biden administration. So the skids are greased in a lot of ways for these to have a really nice commercial path forward and have de facto federal legalization in the very near future.
Do you need to trip to experience a therapeutic effect from these compounds?
So that's a big debate going on right now. I think psychedelics are, they have a lot of the hangover of Freudian psychology from when these, first percolated in the 50s and 60s and when Freud was particularly popular back then. So when these first arrived on the scene, you really had a combination with psychotherapy in a lot of ways. And we do see that therapeutic outcomes tend to be juiced when you combine these with psychotherapy in a lot of ways. We see that with antidepressants as well, that antidepressants combined with psychotherapy, you seem to get a lot better effect than if someone's just, popping pills daily and not seeing a therapist. So there are those glimmers. The tough thing is that that's expensive. If someone has to do a 6-hour trip with psilocybin, the cost of the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, isn't that expensive, but the cost of a therapist's time to be with a therapist for 6 to 7 hours is pretty expensive, and that's not incredibly commercially viable. So a big question and a big debate going on, and no one has a great answer yet, is can you eliminate the trip and still get a lot of the therapy? Or even if you get, half the therapeutic effect, at least it's so much cheaper that could be a superior commercial path forward. And a lot of people are speculating on that right now. My hunch, if you want my personal opinion, is I think the answer is yes. I think you can take out the trip and still get some therapeutic effect. It probably won't be as much as a macrodose, but I do think you can get some. I think on the macrodose front, it's kind of like a type thing. Like if you have pain and you throw a ton of acetaminophen at it, yeah, you're going to get relief. The question is though, what's the minimal dosing of Tylenol you can take to get a therapeutic effect? So any problem when the compound, isn't toxic, and we know that with most psychedelics, they are not toxic to the body. We'd have no known overdose, at least for psilocybin, LSD, DMT in particular. Ibogaine, you could overdose on, or MDMA. There's some neurotoxicity, but for those, if there's no known upper limit, it's like, yeah, okay, you can throw a ton of it at a person and they'll get a therapeutic effect, but what's the threshold? So people are working on that right now. Diamond Therapeutics is working on a psilocybin microdose for social anxiety disorder. They're trying to find what is the minimum threshold, and could you get to a sub-perceptual level with psilocybin and have therapeutic effect. And then some others I highlighted earlier are trying to take out the trip and get therapeutic effect. So Eleusis, for example, trying to eliminate the trip, but get a really anti-inflammatory effect out of these. And we do know inflammation seems to be linked to mental health as well. So that could provide quite a bit of relief to patients on that alone. And then there's a lot of other ones, like I mentioned, Gilgamesh, Delix, quite a few out there. Another one we're invested in, Ocean Neuroscience. I'm trying to take out the trip, but maintain the therapy a lot of ways. So we'll see. The jury's still out on that. There's not nearly as much data around that, but the hunch is probably that if you can still activate the 2A receptor, but in a way that you don't get a psychoactive manifestation, these could be therapeutically efficacious for patients.
Discuss how you can still develop IP around relatively generic sized compounds.
Yeah, so that's another big debate. Is the holy grail in big pharma is composition of matter patents, where you find a genuine new molecule that no one has ever discovered before, and you get a very wide range of intellectual property coverage on that anyone else trying to use that molecule in a commercial context, you can block them. and you have effective monopoly power for 20 years on that. So that is the holy grail of pharma. The issue with psychedelics is that a lot of these are known compounds. The classic psychedelics are all known, dating as far back as even the 1890s. I mean, Arthur Hefter synthesized mescaline in 1893, if I'm not mistaken. So going way back, and then if you count indigenous use of a lot of these, it goes back even further. So we know the Mazatecs used peyote, as well as psilocybin, you name it. So they go back a long time. So how do you get patents on molecules where there's a lot of prior art and they're very known? A few things. One, you can get method of use patents, which are much narrower in their scope, but does provide some protection around these. So Compass Pathways, which is advancing psilocybin for TRD, they have a polymorph form of psilocybin. So it's psilocybin in a salt form, which does change the bioavailability in some ways. It does change how it absorbs into the body. You can demonstrate some interesting pharmacokinetics around that, where they were able to get IP around that. There's other ways of methods of delivery, for example, via IV infusion. We're invested in one company called Bexon Biomedical, working on subcutaneous delivery of ketamine. So it's like an insulin pump, and it's a slow drip of ketamine into the skin at a much more subperceptual level. So there's a lot of ways you can tackle it from method of use. That's one method. Chemical manufacturing and controls also is another area of coverage, where if you find a novel way to synthesize these that others haven't, and maybe it's higher yielding, it's less costly, you name it, you can develop some IP around that. And then there's more creative ways. There's a method called deuteration, which a company called Concert Pharma has worked on this. They're not in psychedelics. They do this with compounds in other domains, but they find known compounds and they replace a hydrogen with an isotope form of hydrogen known as deuterium. It's sort of a heavier version of hydrogen. And the bioavailability, the ADME profile in the body is a little bit different around that. So you can get some loose composition of matter from that. I also have heard of something called hallucination. So the halogens in the periodic table, this is something I'm exploring myself, but more that you can replace some of the I think it's the methoxys, if I'm not mistaken, with halogens. I'm going a little bit out of my depth here, but there's some creative chemical tweaking you can do there. But I will say the holy grail is composition of matter. And that is what we're starting to lean into at Palo Santo, is we're moving away from the genericized compounds. That area seems to be getting crowded, that you have a lot of people with their own novel angle on psilocybin or their own interesting angle on LSD, but it still does allow for a lot of crowding. And so we're looking at the next generation of psychedelics, that takes out the trip effect, but maintains the therapy, and B, has stronger IP around it. And I think is much more susceptible than to be acquired by Big Pharma. I think Big Pharma would give a much harder look at compounds like that. Last comment I'll make, and then I'll end with my long-winded answer here, is you can also get FDA regulatory exclusivity on these compounds. So if you're the first to find an interesting medical use case around a known compound, but a medical use case that wasn't known before, there's what's known as the 505(b)(2) pathway with the FDA. And so you can get a short period of exclusivity if you're the first one to advance that compound. So you can get what's effectively 7.5 years of coverage. It's 5 years, granted, plus a 2.5-year stay period, but it totals up to 7.5 years where you do get kind of monopoly power over that compound for a short period of time. But then it does go into the public domain, and generics, kind of the ankle biters can start eating at your market share after a while.
Does the psychedelic experience port you to a new dimension, as Terence McKenna purported, or is the entire experience a product of the user's mind?
So this is another big debate, more on the philosophical side of psychedelics. There's a lot of different crowds in this world. There's, I'd say, the hard pharmacology crowd and medicinal chemistry crowd, which really tries to break this down to a mechanistic view of what compound is activating what receptor and how does that seem to manifest in the body. There's a more what you could term vitalistic view in here. And we saw this at early days in biology of mechanistic versus vitalistic. There was this debate of, do you have this general life force that just gives life to things, or is life an emergent property? The same debate happens around consciousness, right? Is the brain some antenna that through the ether is porting in from somewhere else or a different dimension, or is consciousness an emergent property that you have very simple neurons, but in total, when you look at the whole rather than the individual parts, it manifests as a very complex system. My hunch is it's probably the latter. I do think consciousness is an emergent property. And while the psychedelic experience can be very profound, and I think bring up past traumas and allow for people to process those past traumas and develop new viewpoints on, troubling or looping thought patterns that seem to be a big marker of depression. I do still think that's happening within the mind. I don't think you're porting off to a new dimension. I don't think you're going to a new universe, but there's a big debate. Some people think you are. Some people think it's a glimmer of what could the process of death look like, or what could life after death seem to be. I tend to be secular in my views of these, but I'm sure a lot of people in the community would poo-poo that. So that's a big debate, and a big debate in psychology and psychiatry as well is how does consciousness manifest? And we don't have a great answer yet on it. So that's just my hunch, which I know may be a bummer to some, but there's certainly plenty in the world. Like you brought up, Terrence McKenna was a big opinion leader in this space for decades, and he thought you were going to a different dimension. He thought that these were a sort of microscope to something bigger out there that we could get a glimmer of.
Do we as humans produce DMT naturally? Does this explain how we dream and the profundity of near-death experiences?
Yeah, so this is another big debate that kind of ventures off the therapeutic side of things, and again gets into the more philosophical realm here. But there is, especially around DMT, and this is a really powerful one where when people take DMT, psilocybin, you're still kind of there. LSD, you're still kind of there, except for high dose experiences when you're going 5 grams plus. And when I say 5 grams, I'm talking raw mushroom content, not raw psilocybin. Something to delineate. If you're doing 5 grams of raw psilocybin, that's a big trip. But so 5 grams of mushroom content, let's say on that, or 200 micrograms of LSD, you do start to get pretty out there. But DMT, when people take it, it's very rapid. It's usually inhaled, very fast acting. Some people will ingest it. It's also the active compound in ayahuasca, but they feel like they're in a different dimension. They feel like they're in a totally different world. And some people think it mimics the near-death experience in some ways. So there's this ongoing debate of, do you produce DMT in your body? Is it endogenously produced? And then there's a whole legal debate there then of people are like, well, okay, if DMT is produced in our own bodies, how do you make DMT illegal? That's an ongoing debate. Again, my hunch is probably no. The hypothesis is that we produce DMT in our pineal gland, which is the same gland that produces melatonin. And one the building blocks of melatonin are serotonin in a lot of ways. So that's the hypothesis is, okay, DMT, which mimics serotonin in a lot of ways, that could be produced there. The hunch is, though, and this comes from David Nichols and Charles Nichols, one of our scientific advisors at Palo Santo, it's just that the amount of DMT that would have to be produced to get a trip is so high that it's very unlikely you're producing enough to get a trip effect in the brain. So based on how much melatonin the pineal gland produces, the hunch is it would be really difficult for the pineal gland to produce that much DMT. And then the interesting thing I recently learned about near-death experiences is that actually people who've gone through an NDE and also tried psychedelics report that ketamine, of all the psychedelics, seems to mimic the near-death experience the most, actually more than other psychedelics out there, which is interesting. That's an interesting new bit of survey data that's emerged. So while a lot of people, who've done DMT think maybe that could mimic a near-death experience, a lot of them actually haven't had a near-death experience to compare it to. So I kind of lean on those who have gone through some sort of a near-death experience and their judgment call on it. And it seems to be that other molecules are closer to what that is like. So again, that's another big debate out there, more of a fun debate than anything that has much bearing on how these would commercialize or their therapeutic use cases. But it's a fun debate for people to play around with. Is it internal? Is it external? All those big questions.
There's a publicly traded company selling test kits that analyze a series of relevant DNA biomarkers along with pre-screening mental health surveys in order to provide insights to an individual's risk and potential of adverse reactions with the use of the kind of drugs that we're talking about. How accurate is this, or is this a crock of what?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. We've looked at, and this is a field known as pharmacogenomics.
Yes.
And it is interesting. I mean, people do have different genomic profiles where they're going to absorb drugs differently. They'll respond to drugs differently. There's an enzyme, I believe it's an enzyme. Again, I'm getting out of my depth as a finance guy, veering into science here, but it's called cytochrome P450. And it does break down different drugs faster in certain people than others. Some people produce more of it than others. And so a lot of times you have to modulate your dosing, even of things like Advil for someone who has more cytochrome P450, for example. So people do seem to exhibit different genetic profiles where these would absorb differently. They could be at higher risk of psychosis. That is the one risk profile with psychedelics. And that's where I say, don't try these at home, is that for a very small number of patients, they can go into psychosis. And there is, if you're at risk of schizophrenia, that's probably the one and only and biggest risk around psychedelics, even though it's a small one. So that's the idea around it. Now, to your point, in practice, can we really detect that? I'm a little skeptical that we're quite there yet. I know even around 23andMe and genetic testing for just heredity, a lot of those are remarkably unspecific still. And so if they can't even get your lineage down, there's a big question of, okay, how can you get a really accurate genetic profile to determine the pharmacokinetics of these in an individual? So I think it's a smart idea. I don't know if we're quite there yet. We've certainly evaluated it at Palo Santo, but it is an interesting concept. The last point I will make is I think we thought the genome would solve all of our problems, and getting someone's genetic profile, we get a full profile of them. What we're finding is that the human body is a very complex nonlinear system, and that there are higher order things to measure beyond just the genome. So there's the proteome, so proteins which are produced by your genes. There's the biome, there's a metabolome. So we are a complex system where just measuring the genome isn't going to give you a full picture either. And we're starting to get glimmers around this, even around gut health and the connection to mental health there, for example. So not a complete picture, but could you get some help from getting a genetic profile potentially? And that could arrive someday. I don't know if we're quite there yet, though, is my strong hunch based on what we've evaluated so far in this space.
We have a strict 5 minutes left, and I do want to give a chance to explain what you're doing and how people could learn more. Before we get to that, according to some companies in the space, when administered as an ayahuasca brew, DMT can prolong experiential effects and slow metabolism. Can this substance help with, and I know we hinted at it earlier, with addiction disorders?
Yes. So that's certainly one. It seems to be the case for certain forms, potentially drug addiction, certainly around smoking cessation, I've heard, alcoholism, where yes, ayahuasca, this prolonged effect, and to give a picture of how ayahuasca works. So it's DMT, that's the active compound, the active psychoactive compound there, and it's combined with an MAOI inhibitor. So MAOIs are what breaks down molecules in the stomach. So if you were to just ingest DMT, it would break down in your system very quickly. You would get no psychoactive effect. So MAOI inhibitors block that breakdown, and it allows your body to absorb the DMT over a prolonged experience, 4 to 6 hours roughly on an ayahuasca journey. It's very prolonged. It's very profound, as we mentioned with DMT, where people really do feel like they're in a different dimension in a lot of ways. And there's that psychotherapeutic element. If you get a lot of surface area to the trip, it's very long. You get a lot of area to analyze with that. So that's the mechanisms underlying it. And we have seen a lot of potential around potentially depression, or certainly, not even potentially, certainly depression, as well as addiction as well. The one thing I will say where it doesn't seem to be as effective by what I've seen is opioid use disorder in particular, where it seems that ibogaine is much more effective in treating opioid use disorder. And there's a lot of mechanistic reasons there, in terms of receptors it's activating that are similar to opioid receptors, but you don't have an addictive profile with ibogaine. So that is the one use case where it seems like ibogaine is superior to ayahuasca, but ayahuasca holds a lot of potential. I think where ayahuasca is difficult is it's going to be tough to commercialize. There are so many different things that go into various ayahuasca brews. So various shamans will add nicotine, they'll add different levels of harmaline and chacruna, and you name it. So, advancing that, the FDA wants GMP grade molecules. They don't like combo formulations. That gets really complex. Sure. To explain what is really, where's the true therapeutic effect underlying that administration. But so that's the tough thing around ayahuasca, but people are working on it. There's discussions of Pharmahuasca. Could you isolate certain compounds and get clean formulations? I think we're a ways away on that, but a lot of people have had very profound effects from ayahuasca and have found tremendous relief.
And Tim, we have 1 minute left. And by the way, everyone, that's Tim Schlidt, Schlidt, partner at Palo Santo Fund. In a very brief amount of time, tell us a little bit about the fund, which I'm assuming is for qualified purchasers, experienced investors at a certain net worth.
That is correct. Yes. So we are a venture capital fund focused on investing in early stage psychedelic focused companies. So we invest across the entire ecosystem of psychedelics. I will say within that ecosystem, most of the opportunities we're seeing and most of what we're focusing on is biopharma in nature. So companies working on interesting molecules, advancing those through IND to clinical trials, taking them through the clinic and seeking FDA approval. With that said, we will look at some tech opportunities that are emerging, some clinic-based models, and manufacturing it in API formulation and synthesis as well around these. So a number of verticals that this encompasses, but we focus on seed and Series A stage primarily in our investments. So certainly earlier stage valuations are quite attractive, a bit more risky at that stage, but that's where we see the real upside and the real potential for a lot of value creation and some of these moonshots in the space. And yeah, we've been around for a number of years, actively networking in the space, have a deep network, have a portfolio already built out that we've been investing in. And yeah, that's really our focus.
And what's the way that qualified people can reach out to you? Is email best? Is there a website?
Yeah, we do have a website. So feel free to check out palosanto.vc. It's palosanto.vc. We do have a contact link there. If you go to our contact page, you can reach us there. You can email me directly. I guess I will put it out there and hopefully don't get too much spam out of this, but tim@palosanto.vc also is my email. So you're welcome to reach out. Well, we welcome, happy to chat with investors, also looking for interesting deal flow in the space. So if you're an entrepreneur,
nice.
Certainly looking for interesting deals out there too, but always welcome interesting new conversations from people.
Well, Tim, this has been a long overdue discussion. Glad I did some research about it and, very thoughtful in terms of your responses and other questions that we had to leave on the table. We'll make sure later in the year to do a follow-up, but I think this is a very intriguing subject and one that investors may, be able to profit from as well. But also, I do believe has very much a positive, impactful focus. So probably even falls under the camp of ESG and impact investing, certainly to more than just a small degree. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles, the host of the Angelo Robles podcast, the founder and CEO at Family Office Association. Check us out. We're very active on Instagram, Family Office Association, so it's easy. My YouTube platform, where some of our interviews make it up as a video, is simply Family Office. You could find it. And our website, for those that are interested in a deeper engagement from a variety of perspectives as an active member, that very simply is familyofficeassociation.com. Thank you all to our live audience today, to those that will watch or listen to this. We hope you enjoy it. And a reminder, there was some level of investment conversation, everyone's time horizon, risk tolerance, their amount of capital, their qualifications, it's all different. This is meant to be a combination of educational at the moment, per our opinion, as well as entertainment. So we hope you have a chance to enjoy it. But anytime you invest, you could lose all your money. You need to do your own diligence and make your own decisions. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Angelo. Great to be
on. Look forward to next time. Thank you.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.